I'm Clarence Lusane. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University, and I'm the director of our international affairs major. My general area of research is looking at international relations and comparative politics, specifically focused on race relations and human rights. And so a lot of what I work on, both as a scholar, but also in terms of policy, is working with social movements and individuals and organizations around the world who are trying to construct public policy that addresses issues of discrimination. And so that's a lot of what my work looks at. And what I do at the university is try to help students, undergraduate students in particular, in the area of internet, train as young scholars, but also to send them out into the field, either through study abroad or through internships, so that their awareness of kind of the global nature of politics gets enhanced. There are similarities and differences. And so, the historian in me always looks to compare the past. So, what happened in the 1960s, what happened around the anti apartheid movement, where you had masses of people in the streets. And so, we have that similarity that people are expressing their politics with their feet. They're going out, they're risking arrest, even seeking arrest, as what happened during the anti apartheid movement. But this movement, I think, is different the moment we're in right now for a number of reasons. One, there's a lot of spontaneity. So there are some organizations, Black Lives Matter in particular, particularly Black Lives Matter at the local level, but you also have organizations that either have started as a result of responding to the death of George Floyd and others who have been killed, or you have simply the ability of people to mobilize through social media. Someone puts up on Facebook or Twitter that we're gathering at 5 o'clock in front of City Hall. And there's no speeches, there are no set of rules, and thousands of people have shown up. So that's very different than what we saw in the past. One, because the technology was not there to do it, but also just the organizational structures were very different. The other thing that stands out, and I think there was an article either in the New York Times or somewhere, that this is maybe the largest sustained political movement in the country's history. We've seen virtually every state, plus Washington, D.C., have protests repeatedly. And in small towns where there are very small Black populations or populations of people of color, people have been demonstrating. And the impact has not been just in terms of what initially started as a protest against the police killings and the extra police killings. So Ahmaud Arbery, for example, was not killed by the police, just as Trayvon Martin, but the killing of Black people in a public kind of way. So it has morphed into a broader resistance around racism that is taking on not only symbols of the Confederacies, symbols of segregation, but also public policy, specifically as it relates to a range of from housing to education to employment, and then in the current era, the disproportionate way in which people of color, African Americans, Latinx, and indigenous people are being affected by the COVID-19 virus. And so the breadth of the movement just in the United States, astonishing. And it has, of course, sparked similar kinds of solidarity movements and solidarity protests around the world. I think we can look at the impacts at various levels, the local level, the state level, and at the national level. So what a lot of the protests are demanding is within their jurisdictions, within their cities or within their counties, that there are changes in policing, the defund or refund or shift funds away from the police department and put those into more socially constructive kinds of policy initiatives. So just at the local level, we've already seen impacts from symbolic impacts of removing Confederate statues to changing the names of public uh, expressions, all the way to police chiefs who have resigned, to mayors who have instituted brand new policies and restrictions on police, and then more generally starting to impact on uh, broader social issues like housing or education. What we're seeing at the national level is a effort now by the Democrats in Congress to push for police reform that we've never seen before. What Congress has historically done with the 1994 crime bill, for example, or some of the other crime legislation, has actually been to increase punishment, increase and approach criminal justice in a punitive kind of way. What has been proposed by the Democrats, led by the Congressional Black Caucus, has been a full-scale reforming to the degree that the federal government can do it of policing in the United States. There's resistance to that from the other side, so it's not much that's probably going to happen in 2020. But if there's a new president and if there's control of both the House and the Senate by the Democrats, we're likely to see some significant policies passed, some significant laws passed relative to policing. So the impact, I think, is strong. And then the cultural impact from simply people changing their names because they have recognized that, you know, when you call yourself the Dixie Chicks, that probably was a problem. And so now they're just the chicks. And, you know, we're seeing that kind of manifest in many, many, many different kinds of ways, which is an important, uncomfortable, but necessary reckoning with the country's past. Part of it has been solidarity with what the protesters were doing here in the United States. So a lot of demonstrations calling for justice for George Floyd and others who have been killed. And there's a long history of that where you had support for the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement in Europe, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So we're seeing that, but we're also seeing it inspire local activities to address their own issues around discrimination, whether it was racism in Germany or in France or in Brazil. You're seeing these protests not only be acts of solidarity, but focusing also on their own contradictions and their own issues. So you see in Belgium, for example, the issue of what was the role of King Leopold in the Congo more than 100 years ago. You see in Germany raising these issues of the integration of people of African descent and Turkish people into Germany. In the UK, you're seeing it turn into also questions about the disproportionate impact of the virus on people of color in the UK. So there's been a merger of both the solidarity and the local issues that we're seeing around the world. Issue of reparations has been an issue going back to actually even before the United States was the United States. There were people who were enslaved who were demanding in the 1600s that there would be compensation for their unpaid labor. So the issue of reparations periodically pops up, but it has never gone away. And that's because there is a debt that's owed given what happened in the United States. And the issue of slavery, as well as the post-slavery era of segregation, Jim Crow segregation in the South wasn't just individuals or businesses who segregated or engaged, but the federal government itself and local governments were absolutely central. And so when we look at the consequences now in terms of the wealth gap, the income gap, the housing ownership gap, disproportionate imprisonment, these did not start and are not a consequence of the last 5 years, but of the last 400 years. And so, in that sense, there is a responsibility to find a way to address how do you remedy and start to repair this history of damage. This is a debate, of course, and I think no one says that there should be a specific amount of money that should go into the pocket of every Black person in the country. And it often gets lampooned as that in order to kind of discredit the argument. But I think what people who are serious about looking at how do you do this repair want to see policies that begin to recognize that there are disproportionalities and that institutional racism in the United States consistently produces disproportionate outcomes. And you have to address those institutional norms that allow for that. And you can craft public policy that makes it in a way that's much fairer. Way we approached for gender, for example, is that women were for centuries not allowed to participate in the society in any kind of fair and equal way. You have to accommodate that and recognize the consequences of that long history and then find a way to make up for it. So reparations, I think, would take the form not of particularly cash payments, but the kind of massive intervention and inclusion that can be crafted through public policy over a generation or two. I'm very hopeful about this movement that we're in right now. I think that the energy that has come from across the age and racial spectrum should be acknowledged. That it isn't just a few young Black people, but that we're seeing across the board people participating and starting to engage the issues that have been raised by what I would call the George Floyd inflection moment. And it's being reflected in poll data, where Black Lives Matter was essentially marginalized and not really kind of given much of a thought, at least popularly, just 2 years ago, has completely shifted around. And it's forced not just white Americans, but across the board, a acknowledgement that there is a problem. And there's resistance. What we're seeing from the president and the president's supporters are a hardcore, absolute, down in the bunker resistance to making these changes that are necessary. The president came into office on what I would call a white nationalist meme and is trying to be reelected along those same lines. It will work for a portion of the country, but there are parts of the country that absolutely are rejecting that strategy. Addressing these symbols are important because I think symbols are connected to how we think about how we make change. One of the things I'm working on now is writing about the proposal to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And there are lots of pros and cons and arguments and debates about that, but all of that's good because what it does, it makes us not normalize the kind of images that have been on these currency for centuries, but to actually say who should be represented in public life and what are the narratives that are important. And so when you put Harriet Tubman up against Andrew Jackson, you have a great discussion. And it really kind of gives you a window into how we should look at history.